the thing that we'll always face in everything in life will be the self. Irrespective of who you are, where you are, you will look at the mirror and you will determine things about this person. You will conclude things. You will be disappointed with certain things. You'll appreciate certain things. And I think it's also intrinsic in the journey to God. The temperament is a massive part of your subconscious and it's always at play. This is what was known as ilm al-mizaj. The Ottomans would use this in classification of men for their career progression. If you were a certain type of a temperament, those were better careers for you. It's fascinating, huh? No matter how good self-development frameworks are, if they're not including the spirit and recognizing nafs, how in the world can it cater for you entirely? You are not just the mind. You're not questioning tick boxes that you can determine this. There's so much more to you in that journey to knowing God. It's impossible to go on that journey truly without experiencing self-knowledge.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the ISNA Canada Podcast. Before we begin, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to our guest. Ustadh Mohammed Isaaq is the founder and principal instructor at Claritas Universal, and he's done extensive studies in philosophy, theology, psychology, and language. Ustadh has developed a unique expertise in behavioral intelligence and counseling, particularly using the classical science of the four temperaments. He discusses how understanding the dominant traits through the four temperaments can enhance our relationships, improve our well-being, and deepen our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Drawing from centuries of Islamic scholarship and knowledge, Ustadh Isaaq presents a spiritually rooted approach when it comes to the mind, body, and soul. We think that this particular episode is going to be very, very helpful in navigating life's challenges with clarity, purpose, and balance. And with that, we'll begin. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the ISNA Canada Podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Ustadh Mohammed Isaaq, all the way from UK.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you for having me.
We're going to dive straight into it, inshallah. You've been working in the field of self-knowledge, and even for ISNA Canada today, you're coming in this weekend doing a seminar about the topic knowing yourself. I would ask you just, why do you think that particular topic is so important? Why choose that topic specifically?
I think when it comes to like a class or a course or anything like that, I think one of the most important things to do is to really give the fruits of the class. I think that is really where this self-knowledge, identifying self-knowledge came from, because a lot of the kind of pursuits that we can have, there will be multiple fruits. And I found that one of the interesting things with this type of learning is that once you get to know yourself, I mean, the first thing is the fruit is knowing yourself. And then I looked at the importance and the relevance of that, and I found out that it is the most consistent factor in everything in your life and my life and everybody's life. So if you improve your self-knowledge, your gym life gets better, your relationships get better, your food gets better, everything improves. So in life, we'll look at like things that are worth investing in, or things that are worth our time in terms of like knowledge and what's worth knowing. But the thing that we'll always face in everything in life will be the self. Like irrespective of who you are, where you are, if you're in prison, like it doesn't matter who you are, you will look at the mirror and you will determine things about this person. You will conclude things. You will be disappointed with certain things. You'll appreciate certain things. And I think it's also intrinsic in the journey to God. It's one of the most profound experiences that one has, because in that journey to knowing God, it's impossible to go on that journey truly without experiencing self-knowledge. So I think that whether you're trying to make money, whether you're trying to get married, stay married, whatever, you face yourself. So I find it to be quite interesting that it was not just the fruit of this class, it's something that we needed in today's time.
Absolutely beautiful. And we'll touch on that a little bit later on as well. But I just wanted to touch on the topic that you've actually chosen as well, or the method of actually knowing yourself. There's a lot of methods out there. There's the Myers-Briggs. There's, secular psychology that's there to be able to, for oneself to actually kind of go, within. But you've chosen the four temperaments. Why is that?
I was fortunate to come across it when I like about 10 years ago, probably a little bit longer. And I didn't believe it. I sat in the class and I thought, what the heck's this? The second time I looked into it, and being a maths teacher, I found it to be quite logical as a proposition, as a theory. So I started to look into it. And I found that it was something that transcended over quite a lot of time, and it was contributed to by many different scholars beyond the Islamic tradition. So I found it really interesting that there's a science out there, a theory, however you want to see it, something that was around for 2,500 years, was appreciated by many different civilizations, was built upon. Muslims really appreciated it and took it to, in true maths fashion, the nth term. They took it to like that, the highest level that they could take it. So I thought that alone, like even if I don't tell you what the subject, that alone is appealing and worth investing in. So I started my own journey with it, and I found a lot of benefit in it personally, in regulation, in understanding myself, in the various ways that I could, because the science in particular, it's true psychology. So psychology comes from the word psychology, the initial part, psyche. We often would refer to the mind. I do this in a class sometimes. I'll say to people like, place, put your hand where you feel your psyche is, or where you sense your psyche to be. So many people will put it on their head. Then I tell them that the Greek word, the word psyche comes from the Greek word psyche, which means spirit, and more specifically, the departed spirit, as in the departed spirit that came from someplace. I find this so amazing. I'm like, so therefore psychology had always pre-secularism or pre-secularization of knowledge. Psychology was always seen as potentially the study of the study of the spirit. You could almost call it tazkiyah or ilm al-nafs or tasawwuf, whatever, ihsan. You had these various ways we could look into it. And there was a common knowledge in human beings that the spirit was directly connected to the body. It wasn't a separate entity, and it was directly connected to the mind. It wasn't separate to that. Meaning, therefore, my nurture of my spirit will absolutely affect the nurture of my mind and my body. So these two propositions were fascinating. I was like, okay, hang on a second. This is very interesting. So when I started to pursue it and study and apply it, which is the key thing, right? I found immense benefit in my own journey. And in true marketing or da'wah fashion, statements are the last resort. The state should sell, right? The state that you form, if your stuff is good enough, I should see it.
The result of it.
Right. It should be apparent. So for me to talk about it is really the last resort. So alhamdulillah, I did share it with my siblings every now and then. And I have a particular sister who's quite critical just by her nature. And by knowing her temperament, I was quite aware of maybe aspects of her skepticism as a default. So it wasn't personal, it was just temperament. So eventually, as the time had gone by and she'd seen certain developments in my character or in my regulation of certain mental aspects of myself, spiritual aspects of myself, and also physical. So one day she said to me, in true skeptic, courageous fashion, she said, Isaaq, you know that subject that you always refer to and you don't tell me about? I said, yeah. She said, teach me it. So I said to her, in honoring her nature, I said, well, give me 3-4 hours for me to really teach it to you. She said, done. I set a date and I started teaching this class. So that's kind of where this came from. And then one of my friends, I did it for my friends and family. One of my friends shared it on Instagram. And 5 years later, and it's been taught all over the world. So why did I choose this? Because it worked. It worked for me. And I didn't go to teach it because I was like, now I'm going to share it with the world. I was invited. The following week, someone in Leeds called me and said, can you come out and teach it? And those who know the science, this is interesting, because those who know the science, they know its power. So I teach it in Leeds. And this is like a very local UK thing happening. It's Birmingham, and the Birmingham was a private one, then the Leeds one, then Burton. Then I get a phone call saying, can you come to Istanbul and teach this? And that was interesting because I was like, yeah, of course I can, yeah. And then I get a phone call in Jeddah. So that's when early on I realized, okay, so it's as good as I think it is in terms of the science, and so I try to really honor it in terms of how I'm going to teach it. And being a professional teacher myself, I really looked at how we're going to break the science down and the activities and the experience. And so that's why I chose the temperament. It worked for me, and people had invited me in a sense because they'd seen benefits from myself. And then now we're 5-6 years in now, and the rest is history. Yeah, alhamdulillah.
For those people who don't know what exactly the 4 temperaments are, do you think you could just give a little bit of a understanding of what that is?
Sure. So the proposition is that within all of us, there are these 4 what were originally recognized as humors or fluids. So the humor, is an old English word for fluids. So this was really this theory of medicine, this traditional or old medicine, Hippocratic medicine, it would be referred to. This is when I lose the doctors now, right? Yeah, they're just like, what? You mean that stuff? And then as this science was developed, they saw that Plato was recognizing the chief virtues, and they were always being categorized in 4. So you had these 4 humors, you had these 4 virtues. This science developed further by Galen, who started to recognize that there was an intricate relationship between the mental aspects of a person as well as what would be the physical. And virtues are always linked to the soul. So there wasn't this separation. It wasn't like seen as like mind and body. It was mind, body, soul. And what was known as maybe Unani Tib at that time, or Greek medicine, had been established, recognizing these 4 energies or humors or fluids, whatever. Anyway, and this is where I was like, okay, cool, whatever. It's some subject out there. Then I saw so when the Prophet ﷺ came, he left with us a particular form of medicine. So what the Muslims then found at that time was that, and this was because it was the medicine of the time, they were practicing this Greek medicine, and they found it to be in line with prophetic medicine. So the prophetic principles that were established, and even the regimen, right? So what they did was they took all the good, like they did with all the subjects, whether it was logic or whatever, right? They took all the good of that subject, and anything that was nonsense, they just tossed it aside. And of course, all these types of sciences are limited to the tools of their times, right? So they will always be based on any empirical data. You will always develop based upon what you're seeing, right? Anyway, as the science then continued to develop, you then started to see the application of it in another level. So Abu Zayd al-Balkhi proposes in the 9th century these 4 mental disorders. So if we follow this formula, it basically means that if I know my temperament, right, or I know one of these 4 humors, so these 4 humors are within all of us, and we have a dominant and a subdominant. So this is what's referred to as your natural temperament. You have a dominant and you have a subdominant. So we codify this in a slightly easier, applicable manner. The history section is very small in the class, but it's there because some temperaments need it. Anyway, so as you can imagine, I apply a lot of this in my pedagogy as well, naturally, and not just in that, in a lot of stuff. And then anyway, this science continues. You see Ibn Sina taking this science to really, who's known as the 2nd father of medicine. And why do we start with the Greeks? Well, because the colonizers told us that all good things come from the Greeks. But if you study it with a Hakim who has sanad, who goes back from another teacher, then you'll find a slightly different origin story. One of my teachers told me that it actually goes back to one of the prophets. It goes back to Idris alayhi salam. Now, as for the references of how far back you can go, these are just my teacher told me. You know what I mean? Anyway, for me personally, I wasn't too critical of like the Muslims are not paranoid, and they've never been insecure like we find ourselves in today's time. What they would look at is they would look at a science as a theory. They would look at its foundations, philosophical foundations, and its fruits, and determine how sound or problematic it is. And that's why you had many scholars who referred to this. Imam Ghazali would refer to this, and he would say that one who doesn't know temperaments cannot even be a teacher, because if you can't understand slight nuances of natures of people. So this is what was known as ilm al-mizaj. The Ottomans would use this in classification of men for their career progression. If you were a certain type of a temperament, those were better careers for you. It's fascinating, huh?
It's incredible, because I don't think temperaments are usually related to Islamic history.
And one of the reasons why is because during that secularization period, there was also massive attacks on the educational institutes of the Muslim world. So not only did you have this secularization, or I would say the bastardization of knowledge, where it was being cut off from its sources in the Western world, you also had the closing of schools in the Muslim world. So the Muslims now, I'll meet a guy from like Darul Uloom who studied, and he'll say, yeah, we studied temperaments. Like, it's part of it, but unfortunately, it's so lost. Every one of those guys I've tested has been quite it's been disaster with their answers. But that's partly because the application of it was quite different from a theory, and it sums up really how even we study other Islamic subjects. You know, people have gone and they've studied 7 years, 10 years, and it's like, oh, so where do we apply this? But because they've never lived in that kind of real life experience, it's
you don't have the
harder
examples
to,
in front of
exactly
you.
to stretch the application of subjects, even fiqh, right? The application of fiqh. So anyway, so that's this science. You have a dominant, subdominant. Once you recognize your dominant, you can really start to see, you recognize patterns. You can start to predict patterns of behavior, and by that, you will have an advantage in understanding yourself massively, because in every situation, you know how you're going to be, and you can almost, like Sherlock Holmes, you can kind of predict what's going to happen, and then maybe I'll tweak this and this, and then you'll see the results quite quickly. And the more reflective you are, the more you will realize that the temperament is a massive part of your subconscious, and it's always at play. And your temperament, like so many people, you know, subhanallah, once they learn it, they'll be like, I can't believe how I've just been the same for so long. And they don't, and the culture in which we live in, and this is also something interesting, and I'll be quiet. The culture is interesting because the culture we live in now is acknowledge what everybody else can do and try to control them. And don't look at yourself and what you can do about a situation. Try to say, well, why don't you do this? If you, like, this is the common phrase of the time. If you listened to me and you did what I told you, then I would have been happy. Oh, yeah, sure, buddy. Do you know what I mean? And wisdom, mostly in today's time, people get after 35 now. That's my kind of estimation, is when they realize, you know, in true Scooby-Doo fashion, it was me all along. You know, you know what I mean? And you realize, wait, you know, but it's so true. And I think that once you realize that, that's when your journey of development and transformation and maturation and rising and all these kind of aspects of the self, they really start to come to fruition. And so that's a really useful part of it, understanding your nature as opposed to your nurture. Modern psychology focuses highly on nurture. So I am due to X, Y, and Z that happened to me. But this proposes, alongside with that, well, what if there are patterns that are natural to you, A, B, and C? Why don't you put them in the discussion and maybe work off those, simply because those are far more constant in your life? Does that make sense?
Yeah. If I was to ask you just to define those, you know, temperaments,
Yeah.
just so that people can understand who are listening, where do they lie on those, you know?
Sure.
Yeah.
So imagine like a quadrant, like a 4-quadrant, and you have, so imagine a quadrant and you have on there these 4. Okay, so we'll go with sanguine at the top. So I'm going to use the Latin terms because we're speaking English. I can give the Arabic terms for the more sensitive Muslims, because unless it's in Arabic, is it really Islamic? And this word Islamic is such a plastic term, unfortunately, now. But I'll rant about that next week. So,
we'd love to talk about that.
I got a lot to say about that. But anyway, so you have sanguine, choleric, melancholic, phlegmatic, right? Or safrawi, damawi, safrawi, saudawi, and balghami, all right? Now, every one of us is all 4, so it's important to remember that. But due to the dominant, one of those will be dominant, and then you'll be a subdominant that will be adjacent to it, not opposites, okay? If a person feels that they are dominant sanguine and a subdominant melancholic, for example, then that would be actually an imbalance, and many people feel like that. So we'll be in class, maybe on the weekend, some of you will be there, and you'll see people who will say, I think I'm these 2 opposites. And that's actually because the modern world loves to create these cacophonic imbalances within us, clashing of 2 opposite extremes. You're hot and you're cold, you're yes and you're no, you're in and you're out. You know, it's like, wait, what's going on
I'm
here?
confused.
Yeah, and it's because not only are they confused, the other person, because if you're not sure, buddy, what am I going to do about that, right? And if you don't know where you are, what am I going to go with this? And if I'm going gym with you, that will be problematic to my gym experience. If I'm married to you, God save me, you know? So the key thing is really start to understand, can we become healthy forms of our natural states? And then can we get to a balance between all four? So everybody will be you'll be a sanguine, choleric, dominant, like a dominant sanguine and secondary choleric, for example. So if I was to define these, the sanguine, person who's of a dominant sanguine temperament, to speak purely psychological and behavioral terms without me going into like inflammation and IBS and acid issues. We'll get to that another time. Which you can also predict, by the way. It's really freaky. So the sanguine would be generally in psychological terms would be slightly the more popular person, good people skills, light-hearted. So when Allah says in the Quran, "Sanurihim ayatina fil afaqi wa fi anfusihim," we will show them our signs, the ayat, right? Our signs on the horizon, meaning externally, wa fi anfusihim, and internally. So many of the things that we see outside will be found within. So I'll give you a quick example. So the sanguine temperament, the equivalent of that would be spring, the season of spring, and the element of air. So they would use these kind of references. It just makes it easy to understand. So imagine spring type people, wherever they go, they want to do gratitude circles. They just got a slightly cheerful nature about them. They spring. It's like, hey everybody, more daffodils, you know. Then you have your choleric. It's generally it goes. There's like a formula with it. So after spring comes summer. So that's if you go anti-clockwise on this formula. Choleric would be summer. So these are the more summer type individuals, hotter, naturally, you can imagine like a hotter temperament. And what this refers to as, they're more doers. So the sanguines are the more talkers, more people. These are the more doers, the more action-oriented people. Their first point of measurement is action, right? Are you doing or are you not doing? If you're not doing, do I want to sit with you? Are you really worth life? That's a bit extreme. But in the same way, the sanguine will be a talker, and if they can't talk to you, then we can't get married. You know, it's
that's a bit of an extreme. Definitely.
No, but it's almost like, you know, well, that's a bit boring. Like we just sat there and we were quiet for half an hour. Whereas some people would love to sit. In fact, some would say the height of a relationship is to sit together and be silent together. You know, and these are different temperaments. And imagine those two were married, or one was the boss and one was the employee, and how would that relationship go down? Nice tie. Okay, did you do the work? Yeah, I did the work, but I love those shoes. Like it's like there's such a. Then you have, after summer comes autumn. This is known as the dominant melancholic temperament. So autumn, what's autumn? Autumn is a time to prepare for winter. Autumn is a slightly more serious nature. Things are dying for new growth, right? So before growth can happen, before we can speak about daffodils, can we address the problem in the room? Right? So this is a slightly different flavor that we're looking at now, right? And I use the word flavor because classically the word mizaj or akhlat, so these would be called akhlat al-arba'a in classical books. And akhlat literally means like saliva or taste, which is fascinating. Mizaj would be almost your mixture. So you could almost categorize these as like flavors. And this is where most people's temperament lies, by the way. And I do this in class. I'll do this on the weekend. I'll say to people that tell me if you think using flavors to describe people is odd. And there will be people who will put their hand up. I'm sure people listening now will be like, yeah, that's odd. Maybe even you're thinking it's a little bit odd. And then I'll say to you, it's not odd at all. In fact, you've done it all your life. And then they'll say, huh? What are you talking about? And then I'll say, if I say so and so is a sweet person,
okay.
All of a sudden you're like, okay, yeah, amazing, yeah, subhanallah. If I say somebody's bitter, a bitter temperament, you'll be like, okay. So you wouldn't go in saying, hey, daffodil. You might go in with a slightly different energy. Maybe they might need to hear daffodils, maybe not, based upon what's caused the bitterness. Maybe some people have a slightly more salty temperament, right? There's just a salty nature. Someone's being salty. We understand that. Some people would consider everybody else to be salty, and then we realize once they come to the workshop, they'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm salt bay all along, right? I'm the one putting the salt out, thinking that everybody else is being like that with me. It's like people will come to you and say, oh my gosh, you know what? I figured out everybody's negative around me. And it's like, if everybody's negative, I think somebody else is negative, buddy. So that's known as the melancholic temperament. So they can sometimes be taken as more serious natured people, drawn towards wisdom. So all of them have their virtues as well. I won't go too much into it just because we'll open up a longer discussion. But that's autumn. So are they the most people? No. But are they more serious in nature, purposeful? These are the more thoughtful people. So you've got the talkers, you've got the doers, and now you get the thinkers, right? Sometimes I'll ask a question in class. This is another one that'll crack you up. I'll ask this question in class. I'll say, what do some of us overthink while others don't think enough? And then I pause. I'm going to do this tomorrow, so you guys get a heads up. Don't tell no one. So people will be saying quietly, and I pause like a good, like 15 seconds in a workshop. I like it's like feels like a minute. So there's some faces would be looking at me like this, right? Like ready for the next thing. And then there's some who will be like, am I the thinker? And it cracks me every single time, because it's like they cannot see that they're the thinker, because they're asking themselves, am I the thinker? Like, duh. And that's the blind spots. Watch how many blind spots unfold just in the week. And the weekend will only cover 1% of this subject, by the way. And already you'll see. And there's others who are like, huh? And they're clearly the ones who don't think enough, because they haven't asked themselves if they're those. They're just like, keep going, buddy. Right? Some of you listening might be feeling like that right now, but I want you to pause and ask yourself, which of those seasons do you feel is a nature, not what you want to be, rather which one do you think people receive dominant from you, generally speaking. Don't overanalyze. This is not secular reductive psychology. This isn't just your mind. This is just your presence. Like when I asked you about the flavors, sweet, if I was to say chili, spicy, you started smiling. Why? What does that mean? You didn't lick someone's face to determine that. So what part of you understood that? So in classical medicine, this was the formation of tib, and this is what this science relates to, is in tib that you would have 4 sources of knowledge. You'd have revelation, which determines many of these things, and health. So I could even, like, forget me, but like a hakim, or my teachers would determine instantly a type of an advice, even for one's prayers. And it may be, for some people, he'll say, go for a walk in the morning, and that will assist you in getting your prayers right. And amazing. If you want to improve your prayer, then stop eating burgers. Ta-da! You have a far better prayer with less burgers in your life. It's just as simple as that. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned about eating to 1/3 for food, 1/3 for drink, 1/3 for air. So you should never allow yourself to be fully full. If you can leave fullness, watch your spiritual journey increase immediately. This is hikmah. This is what this was also referred to as hikmah medicine. This is what it was called, hikmah medicine. And then you start to find this unique relationship between your food and your mental, because sometimes you can eat crap and feel like crap. And sometimes you can experience crap and not want to eat because you're full mentally. That's amazing. So there's such a massive thing. Anyway, let's go to the last one. And so we have this 4th one. So you have the talkers, the doers, the thinkers. So the positive crew, the doers. You have the more idealists, sometimes get mistaken as being negative, but they just have higher expectations in life from themselves and others. And then you have the last one, which is winter. These are the more peaceful people in life. So these are the ones who, they're like winter itself. Winter is a time to just slow down. Generally, these people their life is slower. These are the people that really, when the world went into lockdown, they were like,
hibernating.
Finally. They loved it. This is the pace we should always be at. Very interesting, huh? And so that's the winter temperament. So they're the feelers, right? So this is generally a gist, so everybody can then start to determine. I mean, I would say don't do questionnaires, because most people lie to themselves on questionnaires. And the best way to determine that is put your sibling or best friend next to you and watch them. When you're clicking answers, they'll be looking at you like, what? And it's because wishful thinking and this kind of, we associate our identity, a lot of it, with our masks. And we don't really pause and actually look at like hisab, like really just looking at accounting ourselves and determining that it's not what I want to be, is what is more important. So those are the 4. And everybody will start to determine a dominant, subdominant, and then they can read about it or attend a class or study with one of the teachers. And then you start to see, like the talkers and doers. And that's a combination. And we can even start to look at like famous people who would be examples for these. Then there's the doers and thinkers, right? And doers and thinkers may need to feel more. And the feelers may need to do more. And so this is how we develop self-development plans. And how do we do this? Is the last bit. This is the key in this whole thing. The key is that the in between, right in the middle of it, what is the balance? In history, what would you say would be the manifestation of balance of all these four energies? The Prophet ﷺ. So now we get purely personalized, not entirely personalized because it's all from the Sunnah, but slight different variations of understanding, unique journeys to balance. And if we can get four characters, these four archetypes, to come close to balance in the prophetic way, and we would have four examples of pure prophetic balance, wouldn't that be amazing for us if we can get those four people? Oh, we have them already. And tada, we have the four khulafa. And I bet with that, just with what we've covered in seconds, I bet you could determine which one was the fiery temperament, which one was the summer one, right? And so on. And this conversation then starts. Then we start to see, subhanAllah, we have such a rich knowledge in it. And this is why our tradition took this. And Ibn Sina, he takes this like, I'll just give you one little nugget and then I'll be quiet. He says that different temperaments have sleep patterns and different temperaments have dream patterns. Like that's how far it gets. Yeah. And that's why at the start people equate this to like MBTI or personality tests. And when they ask me that, I say, don't just disrespect the science like that. Like there's so much more. This is not, and don't take a secularized approach to yourself. You are not just the mind. You're not questioning tick boxes that you can determine this. There's so much more to you. So be inclusive of your physical, mental, spiritual to start to understand yourself. And then you will start to see like a natural pattern and then how you're getting to balance. And normally a good murabbi, a teacher, a mentor, a guide, or even an older brother, I know you have some of them here, they will generally be people who will be assisting you in that journey. Yeah.
You kind of just touched on it just right now, that there's a certain type of disconnect when it comes to people being able to look at the secular psychology or whatever, Myers-Briggs, MBTI, all these different things. And then you made the comparison of how this is a completely different way of approaching life, and just not mistaking yourself to actually go into the secular side and making sure that you are taking mind, body, and soul into consideration.
Yeah.
For people who don't know the differentiation, can you paint that picture, what exactly that
Fundamentally, it goes back to what I had mentioned. I used a slightly punchy word, bastardization, which is really cutting oneself off from one source. And what I mean by that is because when secularization took place, what did that whole period do? It disconnected. I mean, Sayyid Naqib al-Attas has a brilliant book called Islam and Secularism. Anyone who reads this book, their life will be so much more amazing. Just as simple as, you want to become more amazing, read this book, okay? And in this book, he talks about three things that are the result of secularism. And I can't remember them exactly, to be honest, but one of them was the disenchantment of nature. So meaning is taken out of experience. But for the sake of this podcast, to keep it very simple, people are disconnected from God because religion is taken out of context. It's the separation of church and state. What that does in knowledge itself and the pursuit of knowledge means that the foundations of knowledge are now challenged, okay, and a complete reset is hit on existence. What that means is basically we now determine truth purely from our observable experiences and our rational experiences, giving birth to what was known as the rationalist period and rationalism, and rooting everything in the mind, because the spirit was now being recognized as, well, how do I know my spirit exists? I can't see it. I know function takes place, but that must be my mind. And hence why in a secular framing, which is, fast forward now 300 years to our time, in a secular framing and all secular sciences rooted in a secular philosophy do not consider the spirit. So when I have a framework that tries to take care of me, but it doesn't take care of my spirit, it's already cut off. Yeah. And because it's cut off in its source, it can never fully take care of me, which is why no matter how good self-development frameworks are, if they're not including the spirit and recognizing nafs, how in the world can it cater for you entirely? And I'm going to say something now, which probably we're going to edit out. But even modern psychology, like therapy that people go to, and I'm not saying don't go to therapy, but consider, well, the framework of that therapy, because if that therapy is not linked to morality, see what secular morality does is it starts to create relative morality. So tomorrow's class I'm going to go into the Love Actually one, is I'm going to show you the impact of this on relationships, bang, and it's going to like it is fascinating. But essentially what it does is it creates a relative morality. Right and wrong is related to me. Now what this does is in a therapeutic model, a secular therapeutic model, I need right and wrong to determine things. I can't just share everything. If I start backbiting, that's not good. So anything secular already is disconnected from God and is disconnected from religion, doesn't consider right and wrong, because its morality is not objective, it's relative. So it's already problematic with its right and wrong. It's not constant and consistent. You see that? How scary is that, right? So what's right can eventually become wrong based upon our discovery of the effects of smoking. Do you get it? Like there's no, and at the same time science is developed like that. Remember, Islam doesn't reject any of these sciences, any of the empirical. We just place it in a. So the Sunusi way of looking at it is you put empirical judgments on one side, you put rational judgments on one side, and you put legal, and using and understanding the differentiation between the three and its classification, how we navigate them, we can then bring science in the conversation of religion. But when an everyday person takes a framework that's from a secular frame, like I said, it doesn't cater for your spirit, it doesn't consider your nafs. Those two things alone show you that it will be partially good for you and partially problematic. A holistic frame that is deeply rooted in the Quran and Sunnah, as I was mentioning the four things, Quran and Sunnah, the rational, the empirical, and intuition. So when I asked you about sweet and all of that, you thought with your mind first, you were like, I've never thought of flavors. But when I bring in, but it was your intuition that determined that, right? So these sciences were formed upon Quran and Sunnah and all these amazing contributions from scholarship and rooted with virtue and vice. Like if once you discover your temperament, you will discover your vices instantly. And once you, I have this one class called Heart Work, and basically it's a journey through the diseases of the heart. Back. Sorry. So we have this one class called Heart Work, and it's a journey through the diseases of the heart from a perspective of temperaments. So understanding that as much as all of these are within us, there will be some dominant ones. So when you navigate this and you learn these holistic frameworks, you realize that with certain foods can come certain mental disorders and spiritual disorders. And by your nature, you must remember that how you receive a thing won't be the same as how I receive it, due to a difference in temperament, due to a difference in mizaj, in makeup, constitution. That's what we're speaking about here. When I speak psychologically, I'll say temperament, but otherwise it's constitution. And so the same way certain foods won't land well with you, certain ideologies will not land well with you. So you have to be very careful. And that gets very scary, because if you then start to, like that's what I spend more of my time. Even though I was grinding spices and learning about these things, I also grind ideologies to see their roots and to see their effects.
And on that note, I think it would be good to kind of go deeper into the importance of that. When you actually have when you're looking at all this knowledge, the importance of temperament, and you've spoken about that to spirituality, how does that expand our relationship with Allah in that moment? Because we obviously, you painted the picture of being able to, physically how it actually helps. It will be able to, you eat certain type of foods, and then it'll make you a little bit more tempered, let's say, for example. The idea is that how does that benefit the relationship that you have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
So ultimately, the journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and emulating the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the ultimate metric of how well you're doing will be your character, right? And when that is the ultimate metric of how well you're doing, like Allah says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, like we only sent you as a mercy for mankind. So a very easy way to determine how well you're doing is how merciful as a person you've become. If you run around with very little mercy for people, I am sorry. You can tell me about all the stuff you've learned and all the texts you've memorized. How prophetic are you ultimately? Where has it led you to? And this is why we're sitting here as, these young guys having a conversation about this, because we are concerned, not just for our own direct experience we had, but also for the next gen, because we saw those people who weren't very merciful. And that's why you're working hard to be something you never got growing up. And every other young person in this place, they are trying to be what they never got. And that is the more rahmah version of the good people they met. Like just building up on that rahmah. Anyway, so the prophetic way was categorized by many scholars as this ethics journey. So when you learn your temperament, you'll actually be able to determine your natural virtue and which virtues you're lacking in. That's what I'll leave you with in day 2. I'll leave you with that. I'll leave you with a specific virtue which you are weaker in. And I promise you this, I promise you, hands down, if you make this as a target for 6 months, when you see me in 6 months, you'll say, bro, I love you. You'll say, thank you. Because I will open up to you not just a blind spot in your strengths and weaknesses and foods. I'm talking about prophetic virtue. And all these classes that I do, because remember, I was like, when I came across the temperaments, I was actually studying Islam, like Islamic studies and Arabic and theology and so on. So I'm like, everything's fully rooted in the tradition. Like my first metric for all of this stuff is theology. And then it goes on that it's really just classical contributions. And I'm just bringing these together. So when I show you like the virtues and certain targets, these are actually classical texts of ethics. Just almost when you open the booklet, you'll be like, oh, this is cute. It will feel like an iPhone to you, like an Apple experience. But it's actually just, and so that's how you'll instantly better your character. And when you better your character, you'll find that you will have so much sunnah will start to develop from you instantly. I'll give you an example. There's a hadith in the Arba'een where the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned to us that what's halal is clear and what's haram is clear, and what has been made clear, and what is in between is doubtful, so stay away from it. Okay? Different temperaments read that hadith very differently. So what's halal is halal, what's haram is haram, in between is grey area. So the Prophet ﷺ's advice is to stay away from it, but it's a grey area. The more stricter temperaments, or maybe the more idealist temperament, the autumn ones, melancholic one, they read that as what's halal is halal and everything else is haram. So they take the road of scrupulousness. They go super like, no, it might be makruh. No. But they'll treat the makruh like it's haram. And that's a virtue for them. But sometimes it can become a vice because they might be doing it with themselves, where as a Hanafi, prawn, never, right? But then what will happen is, if they see another Hanafi eating prawn, how pathetic, right? And then it can create another vice now, which what comes off the excess of wisdom becomes deceit. It becomes an abuse of knowledge. So their natural virtue is wisdom chasing, right? And wisdom, but it can be an excess.
And for the person who's watching all these things unfold, it's like you can kind of calculate, oh, I'm falling into this now.
Exactly. And then the sanguine, who's the more the spring one, they read this hadith as what's haram is haram and everything else is halal, baby. and so that sanguine temperament is more likely to be the Hanafi, prawn eating Hanafi, right? And so they'll just, and so you get this. So their virtue is of justice, and so they don't judge others. They're like, look, it's okay, buddy. I know you're in your and so that's why people like them, because they don't judge, because they're fair. But their fairness can lead them to doing an injustice upon themselves, because what they're doing is they're seeking almost they become lawyers for others, but then they can become a lawyer for themselves. And the melancholic, they become a judge for themselves and also a judge for others. So the prophetic balance would be to be a lawyer for others and a judge upon yourself. Have a higher standard for yourself. So this is just an example of how much sunnah, and there's so many more. The man comes to the Prophet ﷺ, he says, I mean, I can literally just go through like the Sahaba's stories, but I'll just mention this one man. He says, the Prophet ﷺ, give me some advice. The Prophet says, La taghdab, don't get angry. And then he said, and give me some advice. The Prophet ﷺ said, La taghdab. Now, I think we've all heard this hadith. It happens a third time as well. But has anyone ever paused to think to themselves, like, what's this guy actually thinking? Like, think about it. Like, this is the messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And you've asked him for advice and he's given you advice. And you dare ask for more? I know that there's a few temperaments out there they wouldn't have asked again. Some temperaments wouldn't have asked in the first place. They would just be happy to be in this presence of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The feelers would be, they wouldn't ask. They'd just be like, I'm here with the Prophet. The thinkers would be like, this is the Prophet. If whatever he tells us, he'll say. We don't need to say. He'll tell us. The extroverted ones, the spring and summer types, they're the ones who'd like to engage. The talker would love to have a conversation with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the choleric would be very, no, I need some advice. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, la taghdab. So then he asks a second time. It's normally a more extroverted, less social intelligence, very purpose-driven person. This is a choleric temperament who would say, and give me some advice. And he says, La taghdab. So now the Prophet has told you 2 times. And this guy asks the 3rd time. Anyway, and the Prophet said, La taghdab. And if you look into the Balkhi's 4 mental disorders, anger is one of the chief mental disorders. And the other 3 are depression, anxiety, and obsessions or addictions. So you could make this clear relationship with the temperaments that the choleric ones, if they're not careful, they might develop some real anger issues. They might learn to take it easy. The melancholics, because they're idealists and nothing lives up to the ideal, they can be prone to disappointment quite often, right? And this is where we can save a lot of people from depression and anxiety, by the way. And the phlegmatics, the ones who want to just take it easy and, maybe not be as, be the peace ones, right? The non-conflict type, they can end up sometimes, maybe they don't do conflict because they don't want to actually get tested with something. So they play it safe. And by playing it safe, they're actually worrying too much. And so by constantly worrying about how I'm going to be perceived, that might actually lead to a slight type of anxiety. And they can have extreme forms of these. And the sanguine, who just wants to have a good time all the time, can be obsessive of having a good time all the time. So this is how they immediately, they will just be in character. This would come under ilm al-akhlaq as a classical subject. Immediately you can better yourself in prophetic practice within the first 2 classes, within the first weekend. And then we have the specific classes on the mental disorders, and we break it all down from classical knowledge. But that's how profound it gets. And we've had people, one lady messaged and after the class, and she said, I would like to thank you for the class because I picked up the Quran after a whole year. Now, how she made that connection, that's her navigation of herself, right? And she knows the various variables in her life. So that's how it get, one lady messaged, she's like, I just want to let you know I started reading the Tahajjud. How do you make that connection? So remember, whether it's temperaments or anything, any subject that holds you to account will make things better for you in your religion, because that's what the Prophet ﷺ told us, to hold yourselves to account before you're taken to account. And that's where, by that standard, many more subjects can qualify as Islamic subjects. This kind of worry. People will always say an Islamic subject. I'd say to them, is maths an Islamic subject? Is geography an Islamic subject? Because if you work out Qibla, you need those 2 subjects. So these kind of this is where I think it's a re-education that's needed overall as well. And people to realize that akhlaq is there, and other side, and there's a lot within what would be considered sunnah practices. We also bring hadith that are very relevant to certain temperaments as well. So you'll see. And it goes so much more. We have lots of more classes, but everybody needs to take it easy in this step because it can be overwhelming as well. It's a lot to do. It's very confronting. People message, very uncomfortable, as you can imagine. Some, even in this conversation alone, I'm sure some of us felt a little bit exposed just instantly, because it's I'll tell you something funny. When I teach in the class, one of the funniest things to see is spouses. Because what happens is, I'll say something in the class from this subject, and there'll be and I'll mention some strengths and weaknesses. Especially when I get to the weaknesses, one spouse looks at the other and they're like, "You see, I talk." They just make this face it's not only me just telling you, right? It's this guy who doesn't know you is telling you that that's your problem. And then I go to the other temperament, and then the other one looks back and says, Like that's you. So subhanallah, it's just so, it's not easy. One lady messaged me. She said, I'm on the way home from the class and I'm crying on the train, but I'd like to thank you. It's good tears because I had to really face truths. And I think it makes it easier when it's a random dude who doesn't have anything against you, just pointing out certain patterns that if the shoe fits,
On that note, I know we're reaching the end of the podcast as well, but I have one question on that. There are some people who find it uncomfortable to look within themselves. And in my experience, I've seen a lot of folks, especially in our generation, they would be, why do I need to, look deeper within myself? I am a person that I do good by people and people do good by me. And that's, I live life that way. Why do I need to be introspective? Why do I need to go within myself? What's the big deal about that? What would you say to that?
I would say good according to who? Straight, I would say good according to who? Or good according to you? What if the other person has a slightly different definition of good? And I think that it does link in with our times where we're conditioned to really be so self-centered that we only want the good things about ourselves. That's literally how the algorithms and all of our social media just creates this echo chamber of preferences. I mean, that's then therefore all social media is a nafs aggrandizing experience, because it's an echo chamber of my preferences, and that's basically your nafs. You know what I mean? It's what you want getting fed to you. That's why they call it a feed. That's why they call it a feed, because you're an animal being raised in a digital farm. If you don't know that, wake up. It is an echo chamber and a feed, because it's the animal farm, and it's through all these complex tools. So when somebody says, why do I need to look at myself? That's one of the reasons just there is really consider, what are you feeding? Whose opinions are determining the good for you? And I'll tell you something really interesting. When you study an Aqidah class, what's one of the biggest takeaways? One of the biggest things you take away is the importance of the fact that you are mukallaf. You are a morally responsible person. And don't you ever forget that. You have taklif, whether you like taklif or you don't like taklif. You are taklif person. You have responsibilities. You have to take yourself into account simply to measure how well you're doing. Otherwise, whether your metric's good or someone will say, I'm a good person, I'm a successful person. By whose measurement? What is your metric? They'll say, my own. Okay, how did you determine that? And that's why Allah mentions about falah. You guys should bring on a speaker and just talk about falah and call it the podcast of success, because that's what falah is. And hayya ala al-falah, come to success. Earning another million will not be success if the salah is missed. It's just simple. That's not more success. So in the same manner, qad aflaha man, the one who has purified it is as successful. So with all these measurements of good, success, you have to have metrics. You have to have and metrics mean accounting. And that's Allah says, afahasibtum, have you concluded? Have you hisab, right? Have you concluded? Is this your conclusion? Your mathematical accounting conclusion? Afahasibtum is the equals. Afahasibtum annama khalaqnakum abathan, that we created you as random selection. Have you concluded your random selection? That this microphone is here randomly? That you're not going to return back to us. And that goes two of one ways, because if you've been bad, then you'll be like, oh dear. And if someone's wronged you, isn't that one of the greatest like cathartic, therapeutic experience? And that you're not going to come back to us, like someone's taken away something that's special to you, something, the difficulty that people go through in life, all these difficulties that everybody goes through, and you're not going to come back to us. People are suffering so much, and they just remind them that chill, like you're going to go back to God, and everyone's coming back to Him, and He'll take care of things for you, the things that worry you and where your heart's stand. And all these classes, wallahi, like it's not because I want to teach these classes. It's because this is where our society, our problems are at. I'm there, you're there, we're all there. And why are we not catering for those problems that people are going through? And people they need a metric of measurement. That's why all these journals are so, have you seen how popular these journals are? Like everyone's got a journal of like self-regulation, We should call it Hisab Kitab. That'd be good one, huh? You should call it the book of accounting, right? And prep yourself before you're prepped, right? And just because Sayyidina Ali said it, nice accounting, find out if the day is for you or against you. So just go through, somebody should do this. Well, and don't, and I don't worry about crediting because I'll get it in Yawm al-Qiyamah anyway, But somebody should do this. Make a book and call it Hisab Kitab or whatever you want to call it. But every day you should have, and I used to do this a lot. I heard this from some early lectures of Shaykh Hamza a long time ago, and it was so useful. And I would write down what good and bad I did in the day, and I would determine at the end if I was in debit or credit. And if I was in credit, I'd do shukr for it, because what happens? La in shakartum la azidannakum. Right? If you thank me, I'll give you more. So then your stocks are gonna go up. and if you're in loss, then istighfar. I know it's a bit of takalluf, but you're a mukallaf. I know it's slightly difficult, but you're responsible for yourself. So do what you can. And the other flip side of it, just to finish this bit off, is everybody must understand that when you realize, and when you take charge of the fact that you are responsible for things and that you look at what you can actually do about a situation, it is the most empowering notion ever to know that, wait, I can do something about it. If you blame everybody else, you make yourself weaker. If you say, no, I'm still morally responsible. By God, I will be judged by what I've decided, not what I do as an end, but what I've decided. That's why inna Allah la yanzur ila surikum wa ajsadikum. Allah doesn't look at your forms and your bodies. Walakin yanzur ila qulubikum a'malikum. Allah looks at your heart. So try again and just continue to try and measure yourself by those metrics. And then if that trying's not working, change it and try to get good actions. Things like that. But it's so much more empowering to leave and realize I can do something about it versus I can't do something. That's such a defeatist attitude, and unfortunately Muslims have soaked it in. Why? Because they get sold it from a very nafs aggrandizing perspective, So may Allah help us all by being content with what Allah has decreed for us and realize that this is perfect. We are where we're meant to be, and we must look at where we are to determine the next moral decision that I choose for myself, and that's what I will be responsible for.
Absolutely. I think that's an incredible note to end off on, inshallah.
Barakallah feekum.
Jazakallah khair for everything. And I think the people who are listening are going to find this information incredibly useful. So thank you for your time.